Where are you? Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Brighton, and today we are reading and reviewing The Beyonders by Brandon Mull. Our word of the day today is fallacy, which means a mistaken belief, especially one based on unsound argument, or a failure in reasoning which renders an argument invalid. Thank you so much to my guy Jordan for recommending this book series on my Harry Potter review. Let's get into it. Jason Walker, a normal teenage boy, is the protagonist of our story. He's bewildered when he's inexplicably transported to a magical land called Lyrian. Almost immediately, he gets more than he could have ever bargained for as he's thrown into the politics and battles of this land that he knows isn't on any of the maps he's ever studied in school. He meets a young girl who's also from Earth named Rachel, and they team up with a group of rebels, learning that the best way for them to get home is to defeat the wicked Sorcerer King Maldor, who has eradicated or enslaved all the magic users and magical creatures of land, ensuring that his rule can never be disputed. The first volume of The Beyonders, called A World Without Heroes, was released in 2011, with the next two volumes being released consecutively the next 2 years in 2012 and 2013. 2013 is also coincidentally when I graduated high school as a 17-year-old kid. During that portion of my life, I was reading quite a bit, and I read these books as they came out. I had already been introduced to Brandon Mull through reading the Fablehaven series, which is arguably his most popular. I had a lot of fun reading Beyonders as a teen and again as an adult. It's a very colorful and exciting story that I feel gives a lot to the reader. Is it the first time I've seen a story like this one? No, definitely not. In fact, the teen and child fantasy genre is pretty saturated with stories about a child who is transported to a distant land and has to defeat an oppressive evil. While the story isn't very complicated or original, I feel that it was executed pretty well. A quest for the basis of a story is pretty solid foundation for an interesting read. Brandon Mull is an excellent world builder. The way that he writes brings life to his characters, and the world feels very lived in. Right from when Jason gets to Lyrian, you get an interesting sequence of events and a few interactions with the locals to set up the stakes and to get you interested in the story. From the very beginning, the groundwork is laid for you to understand where everybody stands. As I said before, the way that the characters are written brings them to life. They each have their own agendas, their own desires, which aren't always known to the protagonist or the reader. The characters aren't without their problems, however. One of the issues that I have is the main antagonist is wholly bad. He's fairly one-sided, and his only motivation, it seems, is gaining power. I think that makes him easier to root against, but it also means that there's no nuance or redeeming quality to him whatsoever. Some of the best villains in history were the ones that you can almost relate to, and the ones that at least you can understand why they act the way that they act. And I think that to most people, a villain like this just won't be satisfying. The main protagonist in this story, Jason, is also a bit bland, but he does have his fun moments. Although the main protagonist and antagonist didn't really live up to my expectations, there are a lot of other characters in the story that filled in that deficit for me. Not only are there regular human characters, but there are also a lot of different magical races that are really interesting. My understanding of the situation is that ultra-powerful magic users in the past wanted to create life, and they ended up creating these new races. They are called the Amar Cabal, or Seed People, Drinlings, Tree Folk, Manglers, Displacers, and some undead zombies, as well as some other singular entities. I think I missed giants. There's also a race of giants in there. There are also the telepathic and otherworldly servants of the king called Toravors, who carry messages and fight duels to the death.
Nice.
I think that each of these races kind of fit a certain character type because in normal lore you have like elves, dwarves, giants, vampires, zombies, like all that kind of stuff. And each of these races kind of fit into one of those categories. But I think that the ideas that Brandon Mull had when crafting the races are really interesting and worth reading about. There were some ideas that he had that I had never really encountered before and that kept my interest throughout the story. Now, as far as I understand, there are a lot of people out there who assert that Brandon Mull's writing is amateurish and juvenile. And while I disagree with that assessment, let me explain to you why I think it makes sense that some people think that. In my opinion, Mull uses too many adjectives in some areas, and his word choice seems a little bit more advanced than his apparent target audience would be comfortable reading. Sometimes it almost seems like he may have searched up words in a thesaurus to get synonyms because there are points where the story just doesn't flow off the page like I want it to. But my main problem with the series and really all of Brandon Mull's writing is that I have a really hard time with children being able to do what these children are able to do. The common term for that is suspension of disbelief. You basically agree in your head to disregard certain logical fallacies, and concerns that you have in order to be able to enjoy the story. You hear about this all the time when new books and movies come out. Even though people may not put it that way, we suspend our disbelief in every fictional tale to some degree. For book series like The Beyonders, I and presumably other people age the characters up considerably in our heads. While reading these books, there were times where I was reminded of the characters' ages and I always internally just groaned. It's not just what the child characters are capable of, it's also the way that they think and the way that they talk. I do think that Mull does a good job, for the most part, at making sure that the child characters interact like children would interact. For example, there are times where they are manipulated or where they make a decision that an adult may have not, and there's typically a pretty clear line between the abilities of the children and the abilities of the adults.
Don't cross this line!
But there were times during the story where I found myself very taken aback, and my belief could no longer be suspended.
But Brighton, these stories were not made for you. If you don't like it, don't read it.
Look, I get that some people will say that I am not the target audience for these books, and that if I don't like it, I shouldn't read it. However, let me offer some counterpoints. It is very hard to find teen and adult fiction that's not riddled with angst, sexual tension, love triangles, and a lot of other stuff that makes fiction, fantasy, not enjoyable for me to read. Authors like Mull are the ones putting out fantasy books that are enjoyable to me. I would also assume that the majority of people who are reading these books are actually adults. I haven't seen any statistics about Mull's actual audience, but I would assume that many of them are adults. The fact that I have some problems with these books does not mean that I don't enjoy them, and it also doesn't mean that Mull has to change anything or that anybody has to cater to me. It's just my opinion about the protagonists of this story and others like it, and my general opinion about child and teen fantasy. I think that writers, Mull included, could be a little bit more realistic in the way that children think and act. Obviously, these are fantasy stories and there's magic involved, so there's going to be things that are extraordinary. But in general, children are children and they act the way that they act. The writers of a little bit older teen and young adult fiction could be better at writing the characters to where they're not so riddled with angst and sexual tension and love triangles. Not every teenager is focused on those things, and I think that stories that are filled with magic and other amazing things don't need that factor to be interesting. Keep in mind that these books came out in like 2011, 2012, 2013, right when I was graduating high school. I formulated these opinions as a child and teenager reading Fablehaven and The Beyonders.
Oh, boy!
I felt the same way then as I do now many years later. But what is your opinion on the Beyonders series? Do you have any suggestions for what I should read and review next? Please put it down in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you next time reading page by page.